Okay. 5, 4. Good afternoon and welcome to the Public Service Commission of South Carolina. We are here today on Monday, October 24th at 2 p.m. for an allowable ex parte briefing from Duke Energy Carolinas LLC and Duke Energy Progress LLC regarding the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs and the Inflation Reduction Act. This has a docket number of 222-168-A. Let's take a roll call of commissioners. Present in the hearing room, we have Vice Chair Powers, Commissioner Thomas, Commissioner Caston, Commissioner Carolee Williams, and Chair Belser. And with us virtually, we have Commissioner Irvin. Commissioner Justin Williams is on leave today. Let's recognize Staff Counsel Stark to read the docket, please. Just the docket.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Madam Chair, other commissioners, we are here for the allowable ex parte briefing that has been noticed in docket number 2022-168-A that is so captioned, the allowable ex parte briefing regarding Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act and the Inflation Reduction Act. This has been noticed for Monday, October the 24th, 2022 at 2 p.m. Madam Chair, I believe that the allowable ex parte process is ready to proceed.
Thank you, Mr. Stark. We'll take appearances from the parties and then go over some ground rules for the record. Who's appearing for Duke Energy?
Good afternoon, Chair Belzer, members of the commission. My name is Katie Brown. I'm in-house counsel for Duke Energy Carolinas and Duke Energy Progress. Here with me today is Frank Ellerby of the law firm Robinson & Gray. We appreciate the opportunity to be here this afternoon to present on the IIJA and IRA. And Chair Belzer, would you like me to go ahead and introduce our presenters or wait?
Let's just wait a minute and get through the ground rules first, if you don't
Sounds
mind.
good.
Thank you. And who is here for the Office of Regulatory Staff?
Good afternoon, Madam Chair Belzer and members of the commission. My name is Donna Rainey, and I'm a staff attorney at ORS, and I'm here today as the executive director of ORS's designee for this allowable ex parte.
Thank you, Ms. Rainey. We're going to recognize Mr. Stark, and we'll come back to you if there are any additional instructions that we may need, if that's okay.
Sounds good.
Mr. Stark?
Thank you, Madam Chair. As we mentioned, the subject matter notice to be discussed today relates to the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act and the Inflation Reduction Act. I would remind everyone that this is a briefing and not a hearing. The briefing must be conducted in compliance with the provisions of South Carolina Code annotated 58-3-260C, and in part, the requirements of that statute are that the allowable ex parte briefing be confined to the subject matter which has been noticed. I would therefore ask the presenters, the commissioners, and staff to please refrain from discussing any matters not related to these specific topics. The statute prohibits any presenter, commissioners, or commission staff from requesting or giving any commitment, predetermination, or prediction regarding any action by any commissioner or the commission as to an ultimate or penultimate issue which is or is likely to come before the commission. I would also ask the presenters, the staff, and the commissioners to refrain from referencing any report, article, statute, or document of any kind that are not included in today's presentation. However, should such a document be presented or referenced, a copy of any such document must be provided to the Office of Regulatory Staff for inclusion into the record, which will be later certified by the Chief Clerk of the Commission, Ms. Jocelyn Boyd. If anyone during the course of this briefing exceeds the scope or does not comply or fails to conduct themselves within the provisions of South Carolina Code Section 58-3-260, it is expected that a contemporaneous objection will be made. And finally, everyone in attendance today, either in person or virtually, must sign in or register. Everyone in the hearing room or watching virtually must read, sign, and return the form which you were given at the door, or the form which will be emailed to you for your virtual appearance, which will include instructions and the deadline for its return. It is required by law that each attendee, whether attending virtually or in person, certify that the requirements contained in 58.3.260C have been complied with in this presentation. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Thank you, Mr. Stark. Ms. Rainey, do you have any additional comments to make to our instructions on how we will conduct the proceeding today?
Thank you, Madam Chair. I do have a few additional comments to make. I won't repeat everything that Mr. Stark just covered, but I will reiterate that this is a briefing and must be conducted in compliance with the provisions of South Carolina Code Section 58.3-260C. This allowable ex parte must be confined to the subject matter which was noticed, as just read by Mr. Stark. Presenters, commissioners, staff must refrain from discussing any material not related to the specific topic. Additionally, it bears repeating, presenters, commissioners, commission staff are prohibited under the statute from requesting, giving any commitment, predetermination, or prediction regarding any action by any commissioner as to any ultimate issue which is or is likely to come before this commission. We ask that presenters, commissioners, and commission staff do not reference any articles, statutes, documents, or any other material that is not included in today's presentation. Any of those documents referenced during this briefing will have to be provided to ORS. Lastly, the statute requires each attendee, whether virtually or in person, to certify that the requirements contained in South Carolina Code Section 58.3.260C governing allowable ex parte briefings have been complied with during this presentation. We thank you. We thank the presenters, the commissioners, and everyone for their time for this briefing. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Rainey. Ms. Brown, any objection to any of the instructions that have thus far been given?
No objection.
Thank you. You want to present your panel now?
I'd be happy to. Thank you, Chair Belzer. Again, we appreciate the Commission's time this afternoon. We look forward to presenting on the IIJA and IRA. We have three presenters here with us today. First, Cynthia Klein. She's Director, Strategic Business Support. Cooper Monroe, Vice President, Tax Organization, and George Brown, General Manager, Distributed Energy Technology, Strategy and Policy.
Thank you, Ms. Brown, and welcome to your presenters. I'm going to let y'all proceed as however y'all have planned to present. So
that sounds good. Thank you, Chair.
And you may need to pull that microphone a little bit closer, just so that anyone listening can hear you as well.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I hope everyone can hear me now. And thank you all for your time. Prior to getting into the details of the slides, I appreciate the opportunity to provide the Commission with some key takeaways about the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act, referenced in this presentation as IIJA. 1. Duke Energy has a disciplined prioritization approach that considers state-specific needs and approaches to IIJA. This prioritization approach was provided in our comments to the Commission on pages 14 through 15 in the IIJA docket. 2. While much of the IIJA funding does not apply directly to our operations in South Carolina, for those opportunities that align with our strategy and planning, Duke is positioned to support our customers in South Carolina. 3. We are addressing the opportunities in the IIJA through two approaches. Where Duke is not an eligible applicant, we will be providing letters of support to cities and communities seeking funding for their own electric transportation needs. Where Duke is an eligible applicant, we will continue to examine opportunities to complement prudent investment for the benefit of our customers. Turning next to IIJA implementation, the $1.2 trillion in IIJA funding has approximately $61 billion earmarked for specific needs in the power and energy sector, including funding opportunities for grid resilience, electrification, and the orderly transition away from coal. Of that $61 billion, to note, a little more than 10% for both EV and grid will be doled out by state formula funding. The other 90% will be awarded competitively by federal agencies. Duke Energy is well positioned to pursue these opportunities for the benefit of our customers. We are participating in requests for information referred to as RFIs and discussions with federal agencies, including the Department of Energy, Department of Transportation, and Environmental Protection Agency. As an example, to help inform DOE's IIJA program administration, we submitted a response to the Grid Resilience Innovations and Partnerships, or GRIP, program on October 14th. This RFI, along with 7 of our other RFI responses, have been submitted as informational updates in the IIJA docket. While federal agencies are making progress, they are still in the early phases of their overall IIJA implementation, with many new programs actively under development. Duke Energy has developed an industry benchmarked process for identifying priority programs and projects and an operational framework to ensure we are prepared to respond to opportunities as they open, which we'll share in the next slide. While programs are under development, the company has defined its IIJA grant prioritization process, which has been shared in our IIJA docket comments. It includes building a disciplined prioritization framework and operating model benchmarked against industry peers. This process includes proactive grant planning, as the grant application window is generally only 60 to 90 days. Next is grant writing and submittal, and grant execution plans moving forward. Throughout these efforts, Duke carefully reviewed grants the utility may apply for directly, as well as grants Duke may support by its state and local government and other community partners. Duke Energy's goal is to maximize the customer benefit of the grant proposals we submit through this multi-year process. Next, we would like to provide specifically for South Carolina. Within the overall IIJA, there is funding available for roads and bridges, EV, and clean transportation, as well as for energy. We want to note that the state has received state formula funding for IIJA public EV charging infrastructure up to almost $70 million and $5.2 million of grid-related formula funding in fiscal year 2022, with up to $26 million coming from 2022 to 2027. Duke is prepared to support this funding however the state requests. Turning next to EV, we are excited about recent developments within the EV space in South Carolina, including Governor McMaster's Executive Order 2022-31 on October 12th, which included establishing a South Carolina EV Economic Development Initiative, an initiative for enhancing the EV workforce, and creating an interagency working group made up of a variety of South Carolina agencies, including the ORS and the South Carolina Department of Transportation. We are also excited about the Spartanburg BMW plant's recent announcements to be the home of the battery electric vehicle. Duke, next slide for EV. Duke is excited about the National Electric Vehicle Infrastructure Formula Program coming to South Carolina and is available to support as needed. Duke Energy would like to provide a deep dive in the last 2 slides on the IIJA on opportunities for grid funding. The DOE has allocated $2.5 billion in funding over fiscal year 2022 to 2025 that Duke is eligible to apply for. This is very competitive funding in which the DOE will provide 10 awards. Of those 10, 3 will go to small utilities. The DOE has indicated for this funding they will provide a cost share of 50% for large utilities such as Duke Energy. For instance, if we applied for a $100 million award within the IIJA grant funding, the DOE would pay for $50 million. The priorities for these programs at the DOE are to reduce the likelihood and consequence of impacts to the grid due to extreme weather, wildfires, and natural disasters. And the DOE requires within these grant opportunities to show clear customer benefits, which Duke Energy is prepared to provide. On the last slide, for IIJA, to further deep dive into the GRIP program, what you see on the screen is the timeline based on the latest guidance from the DOE. We will note that this is subject to change based on the RFI responses the DOE has collected. Currently, it's anticipated that the Funding Opportunity Announcement, referred to as a FOA, would open in Q4 of 2022, with concept papers that define what applications will apply for due in Q1 of 2023, with the full application for the funding due by Q2 of 2023. We intend to keep the Commission apprised of our applications. I thank you very much for your time and welcome any questions.
Thank you, Ms. Klein.
Good afternoon. So I'm going to be talking about the Inflation Reduction Act, and I've been doing taxes for 34 years, and it's complicated for me. I've tried to make this as simple as possible, but if there's questions along the way, I'm open to any questions as we go. So this first slide is just showing the background of the whole Inflation Reduction Act. Today I'm going to be talking mostly about the second bullet, which is the second major bullet, extending the existing zero carbon energy tax credits and the addition of the new ones. But it encompassed these major areas you see here: revenue raisers, which the big one that applies to us will be the 15% corporate alternative minimum tax. There's also an excise tax on stock buybacks. There's $80 billion of funding increases for the IRS, which is estimated to bring in more than $200 billion over 10 years. There's also a set of excise taxes that generally apply to fossil fuel makers or processors, oil and gas. There's a Superfund excise tax, a methane fee. I know we're not talking about Piedmont Natural Gas here, but it wouldn't apply to the distribution companies. So that's, we'll probably, there might be some Superfund excise tax. It's built into the chemicals we buy for our company, but it's not on us. That the tax is not applied to us. Prescription drug pricing and then Affordable Care Act premium subsidies round out kind of the totality of the act. So the major things we're going to talk about today are the provisions for utilities, which I've summarized here. We're going to talk about extension of renewable credits. We're going to talk about investment tax credit and production tax credit for solar investments. There's new optionality there. Nuclear production tax credit for existing nuclear. A battery storage investment tax credit. It's going to touch on carbon capture and hydrogen. They're really nascent technologies that the IRA gives a lot of incentives for bringing forward, and then a transferability program that's new with the IRA that lets us taxpayers monetize tax credits. So I'm going to sound like a broken record when I'm talking about these provisions, but there was a lot of new things that are in the Inflation Reduction Act that are new to Title 26 of the code, which is the Internal Revenue Code. And there's a lot of guidance that needs to be issued by Treasury, and they're going to have to do it in cooperation with other governmental cabinet level agencies like Department of Labor, Department of Commerce, EPA. So there's a significant amount of rulemaking that's going to go on. Just thought I would go over kind of the milestones on the timeline for that. You know, the act was enacted on August 16th when it was signed. The administration put out a news release and created a lead for clean energy implementation, which is John Podesta, and also a climate team with a climate czar. So that's actually probably a good thing for implementation because it gives somebody that's over coordinating the rulemaking for so much of this act. The Treasury put out in early October a request for comment from taxpayers on 6 different areas, and basically they're asking for, tell us what you think the questions are that we need to answer. And I think taxpayers are probably going to respond to that, but the deadline is November 4th, and they'll probably take the opportunity to say, here's the question, here's how we think you should answer it. So there's a lot of kind of almost crowdsourcing from Treasury already on what needs to be, the guidance that needs to be given here. So that those comments are due back to Treasury on November 4th. And then these last 2 items are really just guesses, but there's probably going to be some interim guidance given by the end of this year of 22, because a lot of these things are effective in 23. But the rulemaking process will probably go on for a while. You know, things that the executive branch can do through notices and those kind of guidance will probably come first, and then you'll have more process-oriented rulemaking like regulations take longer because of all the procedures involved. Okay. So just to ground ourselves in these terms I'm going to be using, there's 2, big types of credits that are involved with the IRA, and investment tax credits and production tax credits. So an investment tax credit is a credit that's some percentage of the cost of whatever target property is involved. So if you're putting in a solar generating plant, an ITC would be based on a percentage of the cost of the installed solar or whatever generation or item is being talked about. A production tax credit is a volumetric kind of credit, and it's usually an amount per unit of whatever is being produced. So there's various types of credits in here, one of which is significant is the existing nuclear production tax credit. So there it's based on electricity, the amount of electricity produced. And then another type might be hydrogen, and there it's based on a different metric, which is I believe kilograms of hydrogen produced. So these things all have different units of measure, but an investment tax credit is based on cost and tax basis of what you put into service. Production is based on what you produce over a time period generally. So prior to the IRA, we had existing credits that were phasing down, and the IRA brought those existing credits back to life for generally a 2-year period, and then it phases into a technology neutral set of credits, where previously, if you had a credit, it was streamed to a particular kind of technology like solar electricity generation or wind electricity generation. Once you get into this tech neutral the Internal Revenue Code doesn't care how you produce the electricity. It just has to be for zero carbon. So solar and wind will qualify because it doesn't produce any carbon for the generation, but that's the concept here. The after the Inflation Reduction Act, the one of the big things is that solar generation, you can opt to either take an investment tax credit or a production tax credit, which gives better optionality. The introduces a nuclear production tax credit, as I said, battery storage, and then has this change over to being technology neutral. So in the technology neutral, once we get past 2024, the phase out of those tech neutral credits is based on greenhouse gas emissions across the whole country. Is where the EPA is going to have to come in. So there's a phase out period, and that phase out period of the credits doesn't start until national greenhouse gases have been reduced 75% compared to 2022. So that's a big kind of calculation that EPA is going to have to figure out and rule on, and Treasury is going to say, here's how we're going to do it. But you know, that's probably, so we don't know when the credits are going to end, basically, because we don't know when the carbon reductions are going to get low enough to trigger us into the phase out. But it's probably way out in the future.
Madam Chair,
Commissioner Urban?
may I ask a question of the witness, please?
Yes, sir.
Thank you. Is it Mr. Cooper, is that correct?
Mr.
You can call me
Brown?
Cooper, yeah. Or Mr.
Thank
Monroe. Monroe's my last name.
Sorry. Is it possible under the IRA to apply for investment tax credits retroactively? And if so, does Duke have, does Duke Energy Progress or Duke Energy Carolinas intend to avail itself of those retroactive investment tax credits?
I will say most of these effective dates are for things that occur January 1, 23 and forward. The one exception to that is the provisions of the IRA allow for you to elect solar production tax credits for plant placed in service in 2022. Now, we don't have any solar plant that we're putting into service in 2022, so I think the answer for Duke Energy Carolinas and Duke Energy Progress is no.
Thank you.
Madam Chair, may I ask a question?
Commissioner Caston?
Mr. Brown, I'm trying to follow.
Sorry.
I'm trying to get my head around everything. Let me get the acronyms. The Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act seems to be funding money, some sort of cash or receiving that. And the Inflation Reduction Act seems to be pretty much in the form of just tax credits until X is done. Duke or no one would recognize that particular funding. Is that correct?
Well, I'll let my colleague speak to the IIJA funding, but at least on the IRA, that's just from, that's not there's no limits or caps or things like that, but I'll let you speak to the IIJA.
Thank you for your question, Commissioner Castor. We should have perhaps done a better job of prefacing those two opportunities. You do have it correct. The Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act is a pot of grant money that's available for applications. And the DOE, depending on the technology and the readiness and maturation of the technology, provides different levels of cost share. So if something is a very less mature technology, for instance, the DOE would work to de-risk it and provide more funding opportunity. So a more nascent technology, for instance, the DOE may provide 80% of the cost, and the applicant would only need to provide 20% of the cost, for instance. And you are correct, and the Inflation Reduction Act is specifically tax credits.
Okay, so when will actual money
Funding,
physically, yes, when will that manifest itself?
I can maybe start on the IIJA.
Yeah,
And then,
absolutely,
okay,
go
sure,
ahead.
I can start on the IIJA. The federal agencies have started slowly doling out some of the money. Some for roads and bridges have occurred. For some of these clean energy technologies for the orderly transition away from coal, those funding applications are just opening up now. We anticipate them opening up in the next few quarters. So that's when funding would be available to be applied for, and then funding would actually be provided in the next year or two.
A year or two, you say? Okay, now, I'm not asking for a prediction, don't want one, but in a couple of weeks, there's going to be an election. Depending on what happens, who knows? Relative to, I guess, that funding or, the House controls spending, could that affect any of this?
I'm certainly not an expert necessarily. I'm an engineer, so a little less of an expert maybe on our regulatory rates or taxes and what the White House will do. But from my understanding, that money is already earmarked and put in a specific budgetary allocation, so it will be doled out still. Yes.
Thank you.
You're welcome. Thank you for the question.
Okay, so this next part is probably going to help you with the Inflation Reduction Act and how the credits kind of roll out of that. But I just wanted, on this slide, I just wanted to note that Duke Energy is a significant regulated nuclear operator, and there's a new credit in the Inflation Reduction Act. It is a production tax credit for existing nuclear. So this one starts a year later than everything else. So it starts in 24 and goes through 2032, and it allows for a certain amount of credit. Here, it's a $15 per megawatt hour sold, and there's a certain phase out. If you, it's based on gross receipts. If you earn too much, then you're phased out of this credit. So the policy directive here is to encourage base load, zero carbon generation, which is what nuclear is. And so if you're earning enough on that nuclear plant, nuclear unit, then this credit gets phased out. So for this one, this is going to be probably a big one for Duke because we are the largest regulated nuclear operator in the country, and the revenues we get for those units is looking to put us into getting these credits.
Madam Chair, I have a question.
Commissioner Irvin?
Thank you. Would the Duke Energy facility in Oconee County, South Carolina, likely qualify for some of these tax credits that you've described in the event that the facility is approved for relicensing?
We do expect that, but there's a lot of unknowns where we need regulations from Treasury to tell us exactly how much. So we don't know exactly, but maybe you noticed, but this is a picture of Oconee on this slide, and we do. But before we know all the rules, guessing at the rules, we think so. And so this $15 a megawatt hour is based on a prevailing wage standard, which is yet to be known. But part of this, part of the structure of the Inflation Reduction Act on credits is there's a small amount of a credit, and then you stack bonuses based on meeting certain items. For the nuclear production credit, it's based on meeting prevailing wage standards in the locality where you have your nuclear unit. But we would expect, more than likely, still need the rules, but we would expect in Oconee County we would meet that, but the rules are to come.
I understand. But that, assuming that, and I understand that you have to wait for the rules, but assuming the rules do, fit with, Oconee Nuclear's, footprint, so to speak, not only geographically, but financially, that's good news for our customers of, Duke, is it not? Because that will lower costs for, production with that facility. Is that true?
Yes, I think it is going to be good news for our customers on all these credits, actually. It's going to lower the cost of the energy transition. Nuclear is probably going to be one of the bigger contributors.
And I suppose that, those credits would also need to be, kind of included and incorporated in future, integrated resource plans so that, we can properly understand the lower cost of nuclear power in the event that that occurs. Wouldn't that be true as well?
I would expect all of the credits we're talking about here would have to be incorporated in all the jurisdictions we deal with, yes.
Thank you.
You bet. So, as I just talked about, and that's what this slide is about, just reiterating the way the Inflation Reduction Act works is it's a concept is a low rate, and then it jumps up to a higher amount if you meet certain bonuses, and these things stack up. The biggest one, which is a 5 times multiplier in almost every circumstance, and this is the case for nuclear production tax credit too, is prevailing wage standard. Again, Treasury is going to have to cooperate with the Department of Labor to figure this out, because I believe it's either on county or census tract level, so that's a very detailed level across the whole country of figuring out what prevailing wage is by different industry types. So that has to be rolled out, but that's a big important one that gets you 5 times. For example, if it's a 6% credit, 5 times, now you're up to 30%. That's a big delta. So the policy is based on Davis-Bacon laws for federal contracting, if anybody's familiar with that. So it's that kind of concept. So for that prevailing wage, it's really about during the construction period, and then 5 years after this project's placed into service is generally when that's attributable to. There's also apprenticeship requirements often along with the prevailing wage requirement. So you have to evaluate yourself, maintain an apprenticeship program during construction. Again, all these rules have to be put out there because this is all brand new to the Internal Revenue Code. I think the statute has a bunch of provisions about, if you try to get apprentices and they're not available, you have to prove that you tried to get them. There's a domestic content requirement, and this is about incentivizing to use U.S. materials in your project, like for instance, a solar power generation plant incorporating a certain percentage of U.S. steel, U.S. Materials, and the manufactured products of that. Gives you another bonus. And then there's a concept of energy community locations. And this is about getting an added bonus if you site your project that's in a census tract that has a closed coal plant or a closed mine, things like that. You get an added bonus for putting it in that area. So all the rules about these things, a lot of those things have nothing to do with traditional tax code kind of things. So those are new rules that have to be rolled out. one of the pay-fors is this 15% corporate book minimum tax, and this is a tax that is not based on taxable income, but it's based on GAAP income, or your book income that's put into it, the 10K of whatever company. And this applies to companies, public companies that are over $1 billion of adjusted financial statement income, which means basically pre-tax book income. The one big thing that you could, or a couple big things you can do here, is you can offset this tax with renewable energy credits. That's a big deal for our companies because we have a lot of them. And then tax depreciation is substituted for book depreciation. So tax depreciation that's in the code is a lot faster than GAAP depreciation, which is generally long over a book life of an asset. So this will bring down the tax base a lot using tax depreciation. So this is probably the biggest area that needs the most guidance from Treasury, because it's a brand new tax. IRS and Treasury are used to giving guidance around taxable income, things in the tax code. Now they're having this tax that's based on GAAP income in your 10K, and so in the statute, I think Congress punted about a dozen times on rules to come from Treasury on this one. So this will probably be one of the first things that comes out because it starts in 2022 or 23, and a lot of taxpayers are wanting guidance on how this will, how to calculate it, because it's hard to understand right now just based on the statute. So just wrapping up before I hand it off to my colleague to talk about the impact on solar. Before IRA, we had just credits that we can use against our tax liability. But with the IRA, a big provision they put in that's also brand new is this concept of transferability. So we would, in the past, do all these solar projects and wind projects, and they credits would carry forward because we had so much tax depreciation. We couldn't use them against our tax liability right away. So in the Inflation Reduction Act, Congress kind of wanted to accelerate the energy transition and now allow these energy credits to be transferred to another taxpayer for cash. And you can only do it one time. And it's elective, but you can basically sell your credits for cash. It's probably going to be that there's going to be some kind of discount involved, to where, let's just say you sell $1 worth of credits, you'll probably get 95 cents on that dollar, just for the fact that there's some uncertainty from the buyer. But the seller, if there's some recapture or some other kind of risk on that. But it's a way to get rid of the carry forward and get your cash today, which should benefit our customers, because now we can have the cash to get back faster to our customers and lower electricity costs. So that is a 50,000-foot view of the Inflation Reduction Act, and now we're going to talk about solar.
Thanks, Cooper. Good afternoon, commissioners. I'm going to do a relatively short presentation on taking some of the concepts that Cooper laid out here and specifically applying it to solar energy, which is a key beneficiary of the IRA tax credits. So to summarize, I think if you want one thing to remember, is the IRA provides much more in potential tax credits for solar than under prior law. And I'll show you later what the magnitude of the difference. They take the ITC back in most cases to 30%. I think most people believe the prevailing wage requirement to get that 30% will be able to be achieved. And it introduces a new production tax credit that Cooper mentioned of roughly 2.75 cents, again with the prevailing wage, and that production tax credit escalates with inflation. So in times of high inflation, you're going to actually have tax credits that go up each year. The company will choose whichever credit based on the facility that we're building and owning is the best value for customers. My presentation here today focuses primarily on large-scale solar. So this is utility-scale solar. We also call it universal solar. For universal solar projects in the Carolinas, we anticipate the PTC will be much more beneficial than the ITC, and that's because the production capacity factors of these facilities are high in the Carolinas compared to other states, like, say, Indiana or other northern states. But no matter what, we'll take a look at the individual characteristics and pick the best one. One other thing that I'm just going to briefly mention is the focus here is on universal solar, but the tax credits for individual owned solar, the ones that are in net metering most times, have also been reestablished at 30%. And they were at 26% for 2022, so that's not a big move up, but they were phasing out such that in 2024 they were going to be zero. So I think this is going to, continue to support individual adoption of solar much more than prior tax law. So with that, I'm going to go through an example. We picked some representative characteristics of a large solar facility here in the Carolinas. So I'm looking at a 75 megawatt solar facility with a project capital cost of $115 million. So that's direct capital, what you spent on the plant. It doesn't include any transmission network upgrades necessary to actually bring the plant into the system. We assume a 28% net annual capacity factor. So that means what capacity factor means is how many hours per year is the plant producing as if it were at full capacity. Because if you think about solar, you have a curve as the sun goes up and then down. So production starts low, goes up to 75, and then goes down. And so this is a common way to compare the amount of energy from different types of resources that have different production profiles to try to make them apples to apples. And in solar, the solar panels actually lose a small ability to produce energy each year. That's called degradation. So that's what that 0.5% is. I'm assuming it qualifies for the prevailing wage, a 30-year asset life, which I think is fairly standard. The weighted average cost of capital, 6.49 after tax, which is roughly in line with current weighted average costs of the Duke utilities. For property taxes, I picked a location in North Carolina. North Carolina is, property taxes are lower in North Carolina than they are in South Carolina for solar. So I just had to pick one, and so that's what I did. And then finally, Cooper mentioned the PTC, ITC transfer. So we assumed that we would transfer it for 90% of the value. So if the value was 2.7 cents, we would get 90% of 2.7 cents for every kilowatt hour that we produced. So one other thing to keep in mind, because I think it was, I'm not sure who asked the question about, will this affect anything soon? You'll notice I picked 2026 as the in-service date. The reason I picked 2026 in the in-service date is that is, for the company, that is probably the first time we would have solar that we would actually be building and owning and putting into rates. And the reason for that is there's a lot of solar that's kind of in the queue now to be constructed and built and put into service. And so that's why I picked 2026 as the representative start date. But
Madam
it is
Chair.
possible.
Commissioner Caston?
I apologize for interrupting you, but I was going to forget if I didn't. Backing up to where I want to make sure I grasp or understand what you're saying relative to the PTC ITC, transfer the PTC ITC for cash at 90% of value. And when you say transfer, to whom would that be transferred to?
We would transfer it to another taxpayer who has tax liability, who wants to reduce its tax liability by applying those tax credits against its tax liability. And they will pay us to do that. So, I mean, that's how it essentially will
Yeah,
work.
that's right. The rules, again, need to be written on this, but you know, the only kind of class of taxpayers that look like probably can't participate in that is maybe individuals. There's passive activity losses that look like might preclude being able to buy credits from Duke Energy. But any other kind of, you know, big corporate taxpayer, I think probably
Banks.
or any other big corporate taxpayer would be able to buy it, transfer one time. It has to be for cash. The market for this hasn't started yet, so that's the, you know, it's being developed right now by people who think about these things a lot. But it's much more efficient than what we had to do in the past, which was tax equity partnerships, which were super complicated. So this is much more efficient.
Well, I thought that's what it meant, but it just sounded like almost
Too good to be true.
or too simple to be true. But so what this is saying, that last bullet there, is that in essence, for every PTC, ITC that Duke transferred, they net 10% if you transferred at 90%.
The buyer would get the difference between the
90 cents on the dollar.
Right.
Yeah, we get the 90 cents.
We get the 90 cents and they get the full tax credit. And that's still a better deal for our customers than waiting for us to be able to use that tax credit on our tax
Okay.
return. That's the reason we would do it. Because we have, as Cooper mentioned, we have a number of legacy credits that are stacked up that it will take time to work through. And I mean, I shouldn't be.
That's right.
You can.
That's right. So we have to work through those, and then as we build new today, you're adding to the existing credits we have that you have to be used up. So on a present value basis, assuming the rules come out the way we think they are, it's probably better for our customers to sell them proximate to when they're created to give them back faster.
All right, thank you both, Mr. Browns.
Okay.
Thank you.
Okay, on the next slide, this is kind of bringing it all together to explain what the impact is on the cost of solar. And so I've got 3 bars here. I've got that representative solar project I mentioned on the prior slide. I'm introducing a concept called the levelized cost of energy for that project, and I will get into what that means in a minute. But first, let me just walk you through the numbers. The first case is if there were no tax credits at all, that levelized cost of energy would be just under $60 a megawatt hour. And this shows you in megawatt hours. So if you wanted to go to kilowatt hours, that would be 6 cents per kilowatt hour. The old tax law with the old tax credits, again, this is for 2026, so there was only a 10% ITC available for a project that would come in service in 2026. The tax credits only bring it down to $58.48, so you save $1.34. The new tax credits, utilizing the production tax credit, bring the net cost to customers down to $37.91. So it's a dramatic reduction in the cost. And the little chart here shows why, that we were previously looking at $11 million worth of tax credits, and now we're looking at $61 million worth of tax credits for the same project. So that's why it's so dramatic. Now, levelized cost of energy. Levelized cost of energy is a common tool to try to compare different generation types against each other. And sort of, if you went out to Wikipedia and said, you know, what's the definition of it? It would say you take the present value of each future year's total costs. So that's your depreciation expense, your allowed return, operating costs, fuel if it had costs, because LCOE can also be used for gas or for coal or for nuclear. It can be used for anything. Taxes, so on and so forth. Take each cost, present value that, and then also present value the expected production. And you take the costs divided by the sum of the kilowatt hours or megawatt hours, and that gives you your levelized cost of energy. And it's a useful tool because with solar, you have a relatively predictable, production profile with degradation, but you may have to want to compare that to, say, gas, which you'd have to run through a model to see how often the gas would actually be dispatched. Another way to think about it, if that's too much detail, is to just think about the single price per megawatt hour. So it's the same price for all 30 years that would be charged to customers for that solar to totally cover those costs. If you want to think about, we'd be charging them $37.91 per kilowatt hour for 30 years for the production for that particular year. So $37.91, I mean, when you think about it, 20 years from now, that's a really low number in present value terms. I mean, that's what levelized cost of energy is. The other thing, one last thing on levelized cost of energy. Levelized cost of energy is useful to compare the costs. What it doesn't do is tell you whether that asset will actually serve the need of the system at a given point in time. But it is good to look at least the cost sides of the equation. Okay, so Cooper also mentioned, and we just talked about actually, transferability. And I've actually covered most of the points in this slide, or it's been covered for me. But basically, because of the transferability, we're able to pass those credits through faster. And I wanted to give the Commission a sense of how much additional savings comes from being able to pass the credits through faster. And so in the case of the PTC, it's $4.56 of savings by being able to pass those credits through more quickly to customers than if we had to wait for it on our tax return. For the ITC, it's not quite as significant, and that's because there are specific rules about how utilities flow back investment tax credits. They have to flow them back over the life of the asset, not just when they receive them. And those rules were not necessarily repealed by this act, but the PTC is not subject to those rules. That's the critical point, that you don't have to follow those rules. You can pass them back whenever you get the tax credits.
So for example, on an ITC, on a solar plant, that's generally, let's call it 25 or 30 years life. On the ITC, you can't flow it back any faster under normalization rules than the 25 or 30 years, so that's a long period. But if you do the production tax credit, which you get for 10 years, it gets front-loaded, and you can give that back to customers over 10 years instead of 25 or 30. And it's richer. The PTC is richer than the ITC, generally.
So concluding the comments on the IRA, I think generally speaking, we're actually very excited about the IRA because we think it's going to help manage and improve costs for customers. And we are still evaluating a lot of rules that need to be made. So, there could be twists along the way that may be a little bit different than what we think today. But I think generally speaking, we've tried to be reasonably conservative in the analysis that we provided today. And I think we look forward to being able to implement these credits in the future for our customers. That's it.
Thank you, Thank you for this presentation. Commissioners, any questions?
Chair Belzer,
Commissioner Carolee Williams.
thank you. I'm going to make this as a comment because I try to be really literal from what you all are presenting to me in my questions, and I'm going to be a little bit broader. And so you may need to just smile nicely and not answer the question. But I want to put it out there. You talk about customers. You talked about credits. You talked about benefits. You talked about being able to process things faster, which sort of suggests an ability to save money from that perspective. And so my question is more, and I understand this is the beginning. When do you think you'll understand more about what it means, how quantifying benefits to customers? And I said I wouldn't put it out there as a question, and I just did. But that's if there is a way to comment on that, please do. If not, that's fine too.
I'll just say, we think one of the more significant credits for DE Carolinas and DE Progress will be the nuclear production credit, which doesn't start till 2024. For budgeting purposes, Congress lopped off a year, so everything else starts in 23, some in 22. But the nuclear production credit doesn't start till 24, and I think that's when you're going to see significant benefits to customers starting.
Thank you. Appreciate your coming here today.
Commissioners, anything further? Ladies and gentlemen, we certainly appreciate your attendance here and the information that you've provided. Thank Duke Energy Carolinas and Duke Energy Progress for scheduling this allowable ex parte, and always thank the Office of Regulatory staff for their participation. Without them, these proceedings couldn't happen, so we do appreciate that. But I'd like to thank you again, and y'all have safe travels to your final destinations. And with that, we will close this allowable ex parte. Y'all have a good afternoon.
Thank you.
Thank you.